For rows, we find that we've got the same values, but this time, with the small alteration to our code, it's done in a row-wise fashion. So now each row is the gradient for that data point. 0, 2, 6, 12. And there you go. So now, if you wanted to keep going, what you would do is, in the first case, for each column, you would... Make sure that's right. Yes. You would average... Wait. Yes. You would average each column. Sorry, I'm making sure that's right. No, sorry, not each column. You would average each row, because it's 1 over m, that. In the first case, and in the second case, you would average each column. So if I were doing, using this matrix here, I would calculate the average here, and the average here, and then use those averages to update my theta values in each location. This to update the average of the first row to update theta 0, the average of the second row to update theta 1, and the average of the third to update theta 2. I can't highlight columns in a very easy way, but there you go. So hopefully this helps. I can put this on Canvas. I think I will, just so it's there. But yeah, that I consider by far the most difficult part of doing this in a batch-wise or a mini-batch fashion. But even then, it's not very difficult. You can handle it using simple matrix operations if you use NumPy. And even if you don't like NumPy arrays, which again, I don't know why you wouldn't, you can easily set things up with lists, cast them as NumPy arrays, and then switch them back to lists if you really, really want to. And you don't even have to do things this way. You could, if you want to set things up with loops, you can. It's just that I think this simplifies the process. If you're more comfortable with loops, more power to you. If there are any questions on this, just let me know, and I'd be happy to explain things further. If not, I think let's go back over what we ended with last time, which was basis expansion. It's just linear regression 6. So specifically, we were talking about how do you do polynomial regression, and we're going to do it by, well, casting it as a linear regression problem. I realize now I'm still on code. There we are. Ha. So polynomial regression. There we go. Regression using basis expansion. So the intuition behind this, as we mentioned last time, is to cast your input into a higher dimensional space. That's the fancy way of saying create new features based on old features. So if we wanted to create, let's say, a polynomial regression using a third-order polynomial, but all you have is one feature, single feature x, then what you would do is you would create new features. Well, I guess technically you have two features, and x0. We always assume that you have x0, the bias term. So if you want to do model something using a third order polynomial, what you would do is create two more features based on x1. So create 2 new features using x1. Last time I formulated this as technically creating 3 brand new features called z, which is again, another way of thinking about it. So what we can say is that z, our new vector, is going to contain z0, which is equal to x0, z1, which is equal to x1, and here's where your new features come in. z2, which is going to be equal to x1 squared, and z3, which is going to be equal to x1 cubed. So these I'm calling new features. So if you were to do this linear, and then after that, you can just treat this as a normal, like multivariate linear regression. So if you were to do this in the x space, technically you would just have 2 features, theta 0, theta 1, corresponding with x0 and x1. Here you would have theta, we'll call this theta z. That looks like a 2, but whatever, it's theta in the z space. You're going to have in this case, 4 thetas. You'll still have theta 0, theta 1, but now you have a theta 2 and a theta 3 corresponding to z2 and z3. So linear regression in z space is polynomial regression in x space. No. And how you would do this in code is up to you. There are a bunch of different ways. What I did is I took the normalization, or not normalization, the pre-processing approach. And so I read my data in, and then I immediately created a set of extra columns that contained these transformed variables. If you were going to normalize the data to 0, 1, would you do it before or after the base expansion? You could do either. Just be consistent with what you're doing. So there's no, I think it would perform better. Let's see. Trying to think of which way do I think it would perform better. I think it would perform better if you did the basis expansion first, because then you don't have to worry about the oddities that happen when you raise values less than 1 to a higher power. So if I were to do it, I would do the basis expansion first and then normalize. But again, there's nothing, the approach works if you decide to normalize first. It's just you might end up with some odd behavior. So yeah, to be safe, basis expand first, then normalize. Then all of your values are going to be correct, relative to each other. And whatever order you do things, remember, when you go to test, in this situation, it's not as bad because you're testing on training data. But out in the real world, if you had a dedicated test set, remember that you would need to apply the same transformations to your test data that you did your training data. So just a note, when testing, don't forget to transform test data to. And that's basis expansion. It's not a very difficult concept, but the more, or at least I don't think it is, but I'm probably incredibly biased. But I do think it is incredibly important to formulate it this way, because this will come back later. The idea that things can be you can make problems easier. Sometimes you can make models more powerful by casting them into this higher dimension. So in this case, we can easily formulate what would be a strictly linear problem we could model into a nonlinear one by moving it into a higher dimension space. It won't be as important with neural networks, but when we get to support vector machines, this concept is going to come back. It's one of the reasons I love this class. A lot of things that we learn early just keep coming back. It's super fun. So any questions on that? Because I want to move on to our next and final topic, regularization. And this is something that we talked about last time, and but I said that I would come back and go over it one more time at the end of class. So if everyone is fine with this, then let me see here. Yes. So regularization, or guarding against overfitting. So the problem... so with polynomial regression, as you increase your polynomial, you are creating a more and more powerful model. But remember, power is not always a good thing. So as polynomial increases, so does your expressive power. However, as you increase your polynomial, the chances that you overfit also increase. So does likelihood of overfitting. And so one way to guard against that, and we mentioned this during class, was to get more data. So you can exploit the triple trade-off, which says that as you, or this is like almost exploiting the curse of dimensionality, as you increase in power, as you increase in the number of features, and remember in this case the number of features you have is directly related, well, as we do polynomial regression, it's going to be related to the order of the polynomial. But as your complexity increases, it requires like exponentially more data to fill out the model. Well, if we could get exponentially more data, then the likelihood that we overfit goes down. So we can address this with more data. So if we can easily get, like in the, let me see here, in the examples, or in the synthetic data that I've given you, I think you've got 100 data points in each synthetic data set. Which means if you like increase the order of the polynomial too much, you're going to end up with a highly variant and just a really, really weird looking line. I used to do this assignment where students would have to implement a 9th order polynomial, and that line looked really strange. But if I were to give you maybe, 100,000 examples, modeling it with a 9th order polynomial suddenly becomes more reasonable. The likelihood that you overfit shrinks a little bit. However, more data is not always available. There we go. And in these situations, it makes more sense to go at the model directly. It makes more sense to, well, like we did with decision trees, as someone very aptly pointed out here, find another way to artificially simplify our model. Or, as I'd put it in the question, penalize complexity. So, other strategy. Penalize overly complex models. You did something to Pokemon to get more data, didn't you? I did. But that was, so you can do it, do something like that. You can artificially inflate your data set. However, that's a method that, let me think here, it's not perfect. And the main reason I did it for the Pokemon dataset was to balance the dataset. So one issue, and people in Discord pointed this out, and I was really pleased with this observation. If you have an unbalanced data set, machine learning gets both easy and hard at the same time. So imagine that you have 100 examples. 90 of them are positive, 10 of them are negative. Well, turns out if you just predict positive, you can get 90% accuracy on that data set because you just misclassify all of the negative examples, but there are only 10 of them. You can get 90 of the other ones. That looks so good, but in reality, it's not so good. And the problem is, if you train a machine learning model, it's going to see that 90% and think it's doing great. And so if it can't eventually figure out how to, so it has to work extra hard to classify those final 10 examples, because 90% looks really, really good. And so to simplify that, I just created a bunch of additional negative examples, or in this case, a bunch of additional legendary Pokemon. The problem is that those aren't real, and in fact, if you look at some of those examples, they're very obviously not real. Like, certain things that shouldn't be true are true. Namely, that some of those Pokemon don't have a type, for example. And I'm pretty sure untyped doesn't exist, because normal exists. So yeah, that's a strategy you want to use very sparingly and for very specific reasons. Anyway, what was I saying? Oh, yes. Penalizing overly complex models. So this is what is typically done to regularize a model. And a easy way to think of this is just what we're going to do. Well, actually, I want to draw attention to a response to this question that I thought was really good. For decision trees, we did this by limiting how deep the tree could go, or after the fact, pruning the tree, fill out the full tree and then prune it. We're going to do something similar here, but the concept of trees and branches doesn't exactly fit here. However, if you think about a decision tree in terms of trainable parameters, what are our trainable parameters? This is a little odd because decision tree creation obfuscates these things a little bit, but you can think of this tree depth and branching factor almost as trainable parameters, or the parameters of the model. And so what we're going to do is something similar here. We're going to go after the trainable parameters. Specifically, what we do is we add, or we introduce, a penalty term. Based on theta size. I guess we should even go so far as to say theta value size. So in this case, the more parameters and extreme, depending on how large they are or small they are penalized. So if you have a model that has a lot of parameters, and those parameters have very, very high or very, very low values, then this penalty term is going to kick in more. That's how we define complexity in this case. Or that's how we define overfitting, when you see either a lot of weights or you see weights that have very high, very low value. Now, there are a lot of different ways to do this, but the way that I'm going to show you, and the way that I want you to use in the homework assignment, is called L2 regularization. I want to say this is ridge regularization as well, as opposed to lasso. I think that's what it is. But L2, if you look up L2 regularization, you'll find this thing. So L2 regularization. So what this is it's the addition of a penalty term based on the L2 norm of your weight vector, of your theta vector. So use the L2 norm of your theta vector. to penalize, well, let's see, of theta, to augment, oh my god, spelling is hard, to augment your cost function, your loss function. Now, it's not super important to, like, know what the L2 norm is, like how to calculate it, because this is all going to go away. But if you're curious, it is simply, what is it? It's the squared sum of your, the squared sum of a vector. But either way, the regularized term, the regularized cost function here, and remember, this is only important because we're going to calculate the partial derivative of it. I equals 1 to m h theta x. Sorry, let me just go ahead and do this right. Yep, xi minus yi squared plus a new term, lambda over 2. Not w, theta. This is the L2, or represents the L2 norm of theta. Hopefully everyone is still with me. Now, this by itself doesn't necessarily matter. But what this is just an extra value put onto our cost function. Lambda, this is a hyperparameter that we control. So this is a hyperparameter that controls, how do I put it here? The size of the penalty. Once you go through and you calculate the partial derivative of this cost function with respect to each vector, what this does is just add a little bit of a little extra bit at the end of our update equation. So the partial derivative of this theta j with respect to parameter j is going to be the same as it was before. 1 to m xi minus yi times x I j plus lambda times theta sub j. This is our regularization term. And that's it. That is how you do L2 norm regularization. By adding this small little bit to our cost function, we change our update equation in a minor way. But what it does is it penalizes overly large, overly large models with overly large weight values, or overly small. So what you do is you just need to choose an appropriate lambda value to control the size of this penalty, the influence that this penalty has. So smaller lambda values are obviously going to have smaller value, larger ones are going to have larger value. What's your opinion on Automatic? Just received an offer from them today. First off, congratulations on the offer. So I don't know much about them. So I can't really say. Yeah, unfortunately. At the end of the day, I don't know, for me, it was about what I was doing when it came to choosing jobs. So like I tried my hand in industry and I found it very soul crushing because I don't know, I require my freedom to kind of research what I want. Also, I enjoy teaching a whole lot. And so the thought of being in a field where I didn't get to teach was very sad for me. And so here I I don't necessarily have a lot of job security yet. The tenure process is a grind and is by far one of the I think on paper it's one of the most stressful things that you can sit and look at, but I'm getting to do exactly what I want to do, and so for me that's what I valued more than anything. And so I think, is it a good offer? I don't know. What do you want to do? But yeah, I'm not familiar with the company. Regularization. Are there any questions on that? Because this is the last thing that I wanted to cover with regression, and if there are no questions, then I am more than happy to move on to neural nets and really just rail on them. Well, on the name neural networks for probably 9 minutes. If there's nothing else, let's add a section. We'll call this neural networks. And we'll call this... I can't wait. Oh boy, yeah, this is probably one of my favorite rants. Neural networks. Oh, hey, no, don't be sorry about questions about regularizations. Does it matter how you choose lambda? It does and it doesn't. So, how to put it? It's a hyperparameter, and so when you choose a hyperparameter, you're choosing it for your specific problem. And so, in some situations, you might want a very, very simple model, but you might just